So, what I thought it might be nice to talk about today is, I think, just acknowledging the interesting times that we're living in. It's actually a Chinese saying, something that you say to someone that you don't like. You say to them, may you live in interesting times. And the understanding of that is when life is nice and boring, it's kind of predictable and kind of safe. But when things start to get interesting, it might be dangerous. So I think it's becoming obvious to us that the world seems to be becoming more dangerous. So when you have the President of America, United States, saying that Russia using nuclear weapons is likely, it's not the kind of thing that one hears every day. And these gas pipes that flow from Russia to Europe appear to have been sabotaged. That is, I would say, actually a fairly serious act of war. We don't know, of course, who did it, but we do know that it's a serious phenomenon to have occurred. And so sometimes we can hear these things as if we don't hear them. But on another level, I think people are experiencing some anxiety. Like there is a kind of a sense of, this is a bit weird. And then on top of it, I think most countries are experiencing very high inflation levels. And that also affects people. What it means is everything you buy and consume costs more. And if your wages don't go up as quickly as the price of goods do, then effectively you are becoming poorer and your savings are worth less. And this also affects people. Most people would like to think that their future is secure and more prosperous, that one's savings will be of great benefit and value. But when you have, I think in America, it's a 40-year high for inflation. And then you have, it's said fairly consistently, I hear it at least when I check some news, that people are saying recession is likely. So these kind of things, possibility of further economic slowdown, combined with increasing price of things, combined with threats of big conflicts. I think it's just important to acknowledge, okay, it's getting serious, it's life has a different kind of a tone to it. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that this is somewhat normal. One of the things I used to say when I was teaching 8-9 day retreats in Malaysia or Australia, around about the 7th day, when people were peaceful and seeing the benefits of the practice, I would usually say to people, we're living in extraordinarily stable and abundant times, at least in the places where I was teaching retreats. And I would remind people that we shouldn't take this for granted, that our parents may have lived through wars, that our grandparents may have lived through the Great Depression. And we're basically trying to get people to be mindful that the world is a volatile place and big changes can happen overnight, oftentimes with people not really expecting it. But I think intuitively, a lot of people have a sense that things are getting serious. I have a friend in America, a monk, who I asked him, is he coming to Thailand this winter? Because Wat Pah Nanachat in Ubon has a big ceremony, and many of the abbots from overseas are coming to attend consecration of a Uposita hall, a place where monks become monks, where people become monks. And he said, no, he feels like he better stay home. He said he has the feeling that we're on the verge of some real history, and that he felt that he should stay home would be better. So that's just interesting. That's a monk of many years who's just mindful that things could go awry. So, but just as I mentioned, there have been depressions, there have been world wars, there have been famines. All of these things are part of the samsaric situation, part of the potentiality when one is born in the human realm, particularly when one is born in the human realm in what is sometimes called a degenerating age. So this is and in a way, I want to mention that this is called by the Buddha a degenerating age, because one of the types of suffering that we have, I think, is when we think things shouldn't be the way that they are. We add this kind of, it shouldn't be like this. It shouldn't be like this. When we add a certain quality of self-righteous indignation, self-righteous anger, it's a very understandable and normal response. But as Buddhist practitioners, when we understand that the Buddha explained that he came in the degenerating part of the eon where the level of virtue of beings was becoming less and less, then we have to have realistic expectations, because we have our individual karma and we have group karma. Another way of understanding this is Tanajananand told me a few years ago that although the human population is increasing, the numbers, he said the number of people who are truly human is decreasing. So he was talking on a mental level. And so as you have growing numbers of people with human bodies, but you have less and less of them in terms of a percentage who are genuinely human. So, and I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, 3 out of 4 beings being born into the human situation at the moment are actually coming from animal, ghost, or hell realms. So they have little merit. And 1 out of 4 is coming from heaven or a human situation. So the way that affects the situation is that if larger numbers of beings with low quality merits are born into the same sphere that we're currently inhabiting, then what we're experiencing around us is to be expected. The world becomes more hostile, the world becomes more volatile, unpredictable, because we are sharing the world with beings with some heavy karma, a lot of beings with heavy karma. Another way of understanding it is if you understand that keeping the 5 precepts is the standard of being truly human, then I think we can see that most people in the world now are not truly human, because they're not truly, most people don't keep 5 precepts strictly. Even the village that I go for alms around, they're very diligent in putting food in our bowls every day, very generous. They have strong faith, but most of them have a good number of beers after a day in the fields. So I can see the empty cans and the empty bottles and in front of their houses. So I notice. And on one level, it's perfectly understandable. They work hard, they're in the sun, they're in the rain, they work all day, they want to relax. Okay, it's understandable. But it isn't good karma. It isn't good karma to get drunk at the end of the day every day. And if most beings in the world are doing this, it has consequences. And so I think as Buddhist practitioners, we have to be spiritual adults. We have to be able to kind of take some hard facts on the chin. Okay, 3 out of 4 beings being born into the world are coming from lower realms. Okay, most people aren't keeping precepts. When I hear that information, the sense I have is, okay, buckle up and prepare for a bumpy ride. What can you do? And in a way, we have to drop the contentiousness, we have to drop the self-righteousness, we have to drop the indignation, and we also have to drop the terror. We have to have an ability to look at this with sobriety and say, it's like this. Ajahn Sumedho so often says that in his teachings, it's like this. And so one has to get some practice of practicing with anxiety. Most people with the thought of a nuclear bomb exploding in their city, that's going to give rise to anxiety. And I think it's okay to think about it. Okay, a bomb might fall on me. It may. And in accepting that as one of the potentials, one of the potential consequences of being born in the human realm at this time, the next thing one considers is, what can I do to be okay with that? Because it's probably out of our control. One of 7 billion beings. I don't know the nuclear codes. And so if a bomb is coming, I don't think a bomb is coming to Phetchabun, but you never know. One might fall out of the sky on the way somewhere else. But if bombs fall in China and the wind blows in our direction, we will get radiation sickness as well. And it's a very, very serious, terrible technologies. And I think, as Buddha's practitioners, Lord Buddha instructs us to be, he asked Venerable Ananda how often he recollected death. And I think Venerable Ananda said 3 times a day. And Lord Buddha says, that's not enough, Ananda. You should be mindful of the possibility of death with every in-breath and every out-breath. So that's our instructions. Lord Buddha says so many wonderful things. Of course, he lifts the bar pretty high, but sometimes having a look at how high the Buddha lifted the bar is very helpful, because we tend to get stuck in our contracted habits and ways of thinking. And sometimes when we look at, oh, wow, it's possible to raise the bar that high, that helps us lift our standards a little bit. Lord Buddha said, if somebody was to chop off your arms and legs, if you gave rise to a moment of anger, you are not a true disciple of the Buddha. So in a way, the reason I mention that is, if the bomb comes our way and we're going to be, eviscerated, the body, then one shouldn't ideally be giving rise to anger. And one ideally has awareness, well, it's a degenerating age. Looks like this is my time to go. And then if we know that death is coming our way, then we put some thought into, what do I want to be thinking when I'm dying? Now, I'm not saying the bomb is coming, I'm not saying you're going to die, but I am saying that it is something that we should include in our awareness as one of the possibilities in this day and age. And so for myself, if I heard some announcement that some nuclear bombs were being exchanged, then I would recollect the things I'm grateful for in life, this life. Suppose I have to go now. Okay, well, I met the Buddha's teachings at the age of 21. I've meditated every day, unless I was traveling or sick, since that time, 31 years. I paid respects to Arahants many times. I paid respects to the Dalai Lama many times. I've been to many holy places. I've kept a good standard of virtue. I've lived a life which is good for myself and good for others. And I would try to fill my mind with contentment and gratitude, and not care if it ends now, because there's a sense of, it was good enough. This was a good enough life. Thank you. Because if the mind becomes full of fear or full of anxiety or full of resentment, then that's not going to make good karma, and that's not going to help your rebirth. And we also have to put some thought into it, like what if the world does develop depression-like circumstances? What if food becomes very rare and very expensive? How are you going to deal with that? And it's good to put some thought into it. It is possible to be content with less. In Lord Buddha's instructions to the monks, he recommended that they eat one meal a day because it freed up so much time for their practice. I guess for a lot of lay people, the idea of eating one meal a day is terrifying. But millions of monks and nuns have done it for millennia and survived. Many of them lived to be 100. So it's possible. I mean, we kind of reframe things. It's possible to have less, and then you choose what's nutritious, what does the body need, what does it not need. And I think a lot of the illnesses in modern life are caused from excess. It's quite possible to be very lean and very healthy. The paradigm of the classic kind of Indian yogi, vegans, who are very lean and very healthy, disease-free. So it's just good to put some thought into it. It's like being willing to adjust if you have to, and having some kind of commitment to not being contentious and not being resentful. Another thing, of course, which would genuinely help the situation is that if people practice more metta, because metta is highly powerfully protective. And I believe that one of the reasons more nuclear bombs haven't gone off is because of the people who keep sila and practice metta. It has had a very protective influence since the mid-40s when the first nuclear bombs did go off. That's quite a while ago, right? 55, 65, 75, 85, 95, 2005. Nearly 70 years since this technology was first used. It hasn't been used again as a lethal weapon. So merits protect us, and loving kindness produces vast merits. And that's what Lord Buddha was saying. If even if someone is chopping off your arms and legs, one doesn't give rise to a thought of anger. I think the acceptance of the law of karma is an extremely helpful, not in a fatalistic thing. And what I'm saying is, if some heavy negative karma ripens, which changes your life circumstances or even leads to death, the ability to soberly accept that as just being, this is the result of previous causes, do not contend. That's enormously going to be enormously helpful for your next birth and your path towards liberation. And understanding the power of karma doesn't make us fatalistic and apathetic. We should understand then, I have it within my power to sow powerful, potent causes, because the path towards liberation is a karmic path. Right speech, right action, right livelihood, this is all karma. Making the effort to have right mindfulness is karma. Right concentration is karma, wholesome karma. And these wholesome karmas lead us to better situations, more opportunities to practice, and even propel the mind towards deeper samadhi and insights. Potent spiritual merits ripen as potent spiritual experiences. So the understanding of karma has to be sophisticated. If there's something horrible happening, there's nothing we can do about it. We don't contend, we don't fall into resentment. At the same time, while we still have the wonderful opportunities that this current life offers us, we knuckle down to produce as much good karma as we can. Being as generous as we can, being as ethical as we can, meditating as much as we can. Currently, there's significant flooding in northern Thailand and in Ubon Ratchathani, and I gave away, with the monastery committee's consent, a certain percentage of the monastery's resources to help feed people who don't have a home at the moment. So 150 boxes of meals 3 times, 450 meals in Ubon Ratchathani, and probably a similar amount in a local 900 meals we offered in the last week. this is the kind of thing that one can do when we're surrounded by devastation or a lot of misery, rather than feel dejected and sad, then ask oneself, what can I do and that is skillful, and do it. And then what one can do then is rejoice. I wasn't able to help all of the people affected by the floods, but I did help 900 people to have a nice meal. Certain things we can do just to buoy up the mind when we're surrounded by challenging circumstances, which are very helpful. Chaganusati, being generous and recollecting one's own generosity, can be very helpful, keeping the mind. Luang Por Anand so often says, not falling into liking or disliking, keeping the mind in the middle. And in terms of advanced practice, when things get interesting in samsara, if we're paying attention, we can really learn a lot about what conditioned reality really is. Because, the cause of us to keep being born, Lord Buddha had this insight under the Bodhi tree. It's one of the ways that the enlightenment experience is explained. He said, beings are attached to birth because of the pleasure that they can gain from it. Pleasant tastes, pleasant sounds, pleasant sights, pleasant touch, pleasant mental states. But he said, this pleasure is always fleeting, and it's dangerous. This pleasure is dangerous because it always ceases, and it's bound up with aging, sickness, and death. Every pleasure arises and dies. Every birth arises, changes, dies. And then he said, the instruction is, know the pleasure. He's not saying that there isn't pleasure. See the danger. Cultivate the escape. So when so-called world leaders, I don't know how skillful they are at leading, but we call them leaders, are talking about hurling nuclear bombs or the likelihood of Armageddon, when there's safety announcements in New York, there was a safety announcement, made an advertisement where a lady comes on the television screen and says, suppose the bomb is coming, the big one really is here. There's 3 things to remember. Go inside, as deep as inside as you can go. Close the windows. If nuclear fallout fell on you, go and have a shower and wash your clothes. And wait for further announcements. And then she ends the advertisement with, you've got this. As if going inside and washing your clothes could save you from a nuclear bomb. Anyway, what I would do is I would go inside, I would close the door, and I'd go and meditate. I wouldn't be thinking I've got this. I'd be thinking, you better stay very, very centered and very, very still and be ready for your rebirth. There was a story from my past many years ago when I was visiting Ladakh. How many years ago? I try to remember exactly. I would have been 13 years ago. 13 or 14 years ago, I was in Ladakh, which is in the Himalayan region of northern India. And Ladakh is a place where it doesn't rain. I didn't know this. Ladakh is a place where it snows. And the snow builds up slowly on top of rooftops and out of mountains. And then as the weather warms, the snow gently melts. But I was with my student and friend in beautiful Himalayan lake, Lake Somariri. We were admiring these fabulous clouds, and he took all sorts of lovely pictures of them. And anyway, it rained most of the night. Living in a tropical country, I didn't think anything of it. And but we both had a really strong feeling. I told him he'd prepaid 5 days of accommodation, and there was going to be an archery show with the mountain nomad people, and And there was an Amitabha prayer festival. There was a whole bunch of things on which would make one want to stay, interesting things, having gone all the way to Ladakh. And I said to him, Francois, I don't know what it is, but I just have this strong feeling that I should go. But I feel bad because you've prepaid the accommodation and the food, and monks are supposed to be content with what they're given and not cost people money unnecessarily. But anyway, Francois is also an intuitive person, and he says, I have the same feeling. And so we said goodbye. There was a group of Australians there that were participating in giving out Polaroid sunglasses to the Hill Tribe people who tend to get cataracts. And there was an optometrist who was checking people's eyes. And the archery show was the next day, and the prayer festival had a couple more days. And we said goodbye to everybody, and they're like, why are you leaving? And anyway, we did leave. And I think an hour after we left, a mudslide closed the road off. And those people had to walk up and over Himalayan mountains for 2 days to find another road. And we soon realized that rain in Ladakh is a big deal because there were these big boulders. It was kind of interesting driving in these very, very windy roads, and you kind of have to look sideways and up to see the top of the mountains. I mean, these are very tall mountains. Thailand doesn't have mountains like this. And there's all these big boulders in the valley. And I remember saying, it's like God placed these boulders elegantly. And I'm not saying I believe in God, but I was just saying, and there are all these wildflowers, and it was all beautiful. And we're coming out of this, it's like, God did not place those boulders. I'm looking outside the car, and there's all these big rocks all the way up the mountain that are getting ready to roll down into the valley, just like the ones in the valley used to be halfway up the mountain, because the Himalayas is where two continents hit each other, and basically they go up and up and up and up. And you can find fossils of fish and sea urchins on the top of the Himalayas because it used to be under the ocean. So anyway, we quickly realized that one of those big rocks might be coming for us. And so I chanted the Metta Sutta, I think, for an hour and a half. And yes, these beautiful winding streams and wildflowers had become a large, gushing brown mess. And we actually had to stop and help pull a boulder off the road with a bunch of Tibetans so that we could pass. And anyway, when we stayed in Leh that night, unfortunately, just a couple of kilometers away from us, 200 people died under a mudslide. Leh is a valley surrounded by tall mountains, and a big chunk of a mountain just slipped down the hill and buried 200 people in their sleep. Now, what happened is the next night, it started to rain again. And there were a couple of guests, and there were the local villagers, and everybody was upset. And Francois came to me and they said, the village headman or the mayor is saying that everybody should gather in the center of the city. And I looked at Francois and I said, we're in a valley completely surrounded by steep mountains. There were large mudslides last night, and it's raining again. But I'm not going to go and hang out with a bunch of scared, anxious, panicking people. Where can you go when you're in a valley surrounded by mountains, which might become mudslides? That's safe. There's nowhere. I'm going to meditate. And if the mud comes, the mud comes. And I don't want to be kind of anxious if this is the time that I leave this life. And I lit my candles and I lit my incense, and I thought about, I get weepy thinking about it. I just thought about how grateful I am for this life. How grateful I am to Lumpur Liam, my preceptor. How grateful I am to Lumpur Samedo, Lumpur Pasana, Ajahn Jayasaro, Ajahn Anan, the Dalai Lama. How grateful I was to Bodhgaya, the opportunity to be a monk, hearing Buddhist teachings, meditation retreats, the opportunity to teach others. And I was in a very genuinely content and happy space. And in some respects, it would have been a great time to die. But anyway, I'm still here. And I've paid respects to more arahants, and I've done more meditation retreats, and I've helped more people, and built a monastery. And so I would hope that, if it's a bomb this time or whatever the upcoming threat might be, that I would behave in the same way. Sit, cross my legs, think of things I'm grateful for, not be contentious, and be willing to leave if it's time. So, so anyway, just a few reflections on not being contentious with samsara and being diligent about sowing positive, wholesome causes, and practicing loving kindness as a protection for oneself. And I think I'll tell another personal story. I don't even think this is a first. I've never told this story in public. Do you want to hear a story? Are you bored yet? You want to hear a story? Nodding heads. I had a dream when I was a 3-pansa bhikkhu at Wat Pah Nanachat. And in that dream, I had a brown body and a red robe. And it was very interesting. I knew in that dream that it was northern India 900 years ago. And 2 people, I was a monk in that dream. And 2 people came rushing into the monks' cells, wearing black outfits and having something like a crowbar. And this person came running for me. I had a brown body and a red robe, and in the dream I experienced that as being me 900 years ago. And I had the thought, this is karma. There's nothing I can do about this. And that soldier put his crowbar through the top of my skull. And then he raised it up and he put it down through my neck into the heart. Now, what's interesting about this is I didn't know much about Buddhist history at the time. I'd never studied it. I ended up asking Ajahn Amaro a couple of years later, about a year later. I told him about this experience, and he says, yes, there were the Turkish Muslim invasions in northern India where many, many monks and nuns were killed, and the monasteries were destroyed, and the libraries of Nalanda were burnt, and the books burnt for weeks. And then later on, I asked a teacher of mine who has special abilities. I had this dream, and he said, yes, you were a monk in Nalanda 900 years ago, and you were killed by Turkish Muslim invaders. But what was interesting about that experience is I'm sure that monk knew that they were coming. And he'd made a decision to die as a monk peacefully. And so I'm not saying that I don't have the ability to know that that's a fact, but I did have the dream. And Ajahn Amaro told me it was part of Buddhist history of India. And one of my teachers confirmed that it did happen. And so if I got up and tried to contend with that person, I may not have had subsequent rebirths where I could be a monk again. It's like, I guess the point I want to make is, suppose we end up having to live through depression-like circumstances. Do we allow the mind to become like a hungry ghost? Or do we allow ourselves to abide with it peacefully and not contentiously? And again, I'm not saying don't be responsible. Be as responsible as you can be. If your own leaders are telling you there may be food shortages, by all means stock up on basics. I think that would be a good idea. And but if the day comes when there are more difficulties, more conflicts, more shortages, don't become one of the marauding, rioting zombies of the zombie apocalypse. You be peaceful and learn from it. This is the consequence of birth. This is the danger of samsara. And I'm determined to maintain my sincere, true level of humanity and possibly even be like a deva by practicing forgiveness, non-contentiousness, loving kindness, not giving rise to anger. So I offer that for your reflection. I hope something I've said has been helpful.